And hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we are going to take a look at the Ghost of Tsushima PC port and see how it performs on different graphics cards and processors. Let's get to it. So, Ghost of Tsushima is a game that was originally released on PS4 in 2020. It was developed by Sucker Punch, to whom we also owe the Sly Cooper and Infamous series. Ghost of Tsushima runs on an in-house engine from Sucker Punch, and despite the fact that the game is an old-gen game, so to speak, as it was clearly designed for PS4, well, I think the game aged well, thanks to its really solid artistic direction, and the complete package is still super clean. The game still looks really good, even if it does not include all the latest technologies, and that's visible on certain aspects of the game, but I don't find it to be a big issue here. I played the game at the time on PS4 and I really enjoyed it, despite the fact that I am not always a fan of open world style games like those, and some people compare it to an Assassin's Creed type of game. Personally, I find that the combat system and the general atmosphere of this game to be above what Ubisoft offers, but well, to each their own. Everyone will have their opinion, and it's also true that Ghost of Tsushima is one of these first-party games from Sony that took a bit of time to come to PC, but here it is finally. The port is made by Nixes, who are doing quite a bit of work lately, since they were also the ones who were in charge of porting Horizon Forbidden West, that we saw not too long ago. And this port of Ghost of Tsushima is a director's cut, and the port is rather good. No status to report, game is moderately demanding, but not as much as Horizon Forbidden West, obviously. We will see the performances later, but if we take into account that even on PS5 the native mode used checkerboarding, so a sort of upscaling to reach 60 FPS average, it's not all that surprising that the game remains relatively demanding on PC, but it will run on relatively modest hardware too. For the PC port, we find the usual host of features, ultra-wide support, and the game looks really good on a 21:9 monitor. It's a treat. We also have unlocked FPS and also a whole bunch of anti-aliasing, upscaling, and frame generation options. In terms of graphics menus, it's similar to what Nixes produced with their other ports. Menus where you can directly see the effect on the screen, and that's a plus. It should always be like this. The title supports DLSS upscaling as well as Nvidia's frame generation, Reflex and GLAA. For Intel we find XeSS in its latest version, which includes the XeSS native AA as well as an Intel option for ambient occlusion, the XeGTAO, which I find pretty good. Personally, I prefer it to SSAO or HBAO+. And for AMD we get FSR upscaling, FSR native AA as well as FSR frame generation. And also we are on FSR 3.0. We find one of the features which had been announced for FSR 3.1. We can now use FSR frame generation with any type of upscaler, which was not the case in other games until now, where we were forced to use FSR upscaling to use FSR frame generation unless going with mods. So in this game you can couple FSR FG with DLSS or XeSS, which is great news. As far as upscaling is concerned, well, in terms of image quality, without much surprise, DLSS wins over FSR and XeSS DP4A. The reconstruction is more stable than with the other two, and the image is very clean overall. And for FSR, I was a little afraid given that it's a title with a lot of foliage, but at 4K FSR balance, it's quite alright. We find more sizzling on foliage than with DLSS, but it's not as bad as some other games. At 1440p, so even in quality mode, DLSS wins more clearly there. XeSS can be an in-between for AMD card holders. It's a bit cleaner than FSR, but the difference is not really absolutely crazy in this game either. Even with Intel cards, I found that the implementation is not the best we have seen for XeSS. Regarding frame generation, in terms of image quality, the DLSS frame gen works pretty well. The frame time and pacing are generally quite good. However, the heaviness of it means that, as in a lot of other titles, it's not always super relevant to use. It will all depend on your card and needs. And for FSR frame gen, frame pacing remains a bit less stable than Nvidia's frame generation, but as we can now couple it with other upscalers than FSR, it removes its big weakness, which was precisely the upscaling part of FSR when using a card other than an AMD one. So here, face to face with DLSS frame generation with DLSS as base upscaling for both frame generation, well, the two of them are quite close in terms of image quality. There is still some problems to solve for both techs on this title, on the UI and menus and all that, but nothing exactly game-breaking. On the other hand, the strength of the FSR frame gen is that it's lighter than the DLSS frame gen. We'll get back to that later. The game also compiles shader on first launch. It's quite fast, and you might not even see it since it's done in the background, but if the processor is going full blast for a moment, it is what it is. And the developers have already pointed out that yes, it can crash with Intel 13 and 14th gen CPU. And in terms of drivers, the three GPUs manufacturers released their dedicated drivers a few days before the title release. So let's see how it goes performance-wise. The test sequence is a 1-minute horse ride. I played the intro of the game and the performance seemed stable on the whole, and I hope that it remains the same throughout the entirety of the game. I encountered a few crashes when activating FSR FrameGen on some AMD cards, but after restarting the title or the world computer, no more issues for me, so it doesn't seem all that bad. Anyway, let's take a look. So at 1080p high details, well, we see that it's a game that suffers from driver overhead for Nvidia cards, and it had been a while since we saw some of that, so the 7900 XTX finished first here. But well, we are around 200 FPS on average, so 1% are quite close to, and the 4 cards at the top of the chart will offer you excellent performances at 1080p, but it would have been kind of sad if it wasn't the case. But we can see that the game seemed to favor AMD cards, since we find the 7800 XT and GRE ahead of the 4070 Ti Super or 1390 Ti and 4070 Super, which is quite rare. We also see that for the GRE, it offers nothing more than the 7800 XT in this title. It's a bit like with Assassin's Creed Mirage here. It may seem surprising, but there are a few games where it behaves this way. The 7700 XT is at the same level as the 4070 and 3080 here. The 6700 XT is ahead of the 4060 Ti and 2080 Ti, with the 7600 also ending up a good notch above the 4060. The 1080 Ti doesn't particularly shine here either, since here it does even worse than the RTX 2060 and clearly below the 3060, which is also quite rare. Intel's cards are also doing alright, but not amazing, and as usual, the GTX 1060 and A380 are at the bottom of the chart, with the 1060 doing better, as it often is the case. But for the 1060, it's a bit difficult to reach 60 FPS average, even by lowering settings. At medium, with FSR quality, we get around 45 to 50 FPS average, which is probably the best compromise for this type of card, and the game still remains playable, so that's probably what I will do. We move to 1440p. The 4090 is now ahead of the 7900 XTX by a short lead, but clearly for the rest of the chart, we still find an advantage for the Radeons overall. The 4080 Super is just behind the 7900 XT, the 7800 XT and GRE still hold their own against the 4070 Ti Super and 3090 Ti. Just like the 7700 XT, it still remains very close to the 4070 and 3080. No big changes compared to 1080p. At 1440p ultra-wide, well, as is often the case with Nixie Sport, the performances remain very, very close to 1440p with roughly 5 FPS less average for all cards, so I don't know if it's the way Nixies make their ports, but it was the same on Horizon Forbidden West or Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart last year, so no point wasting much time here, but we see that even natively, the 3060 Ti still holds a 60 FPS average, which is pretty nice. And at 4K now, as usual, the performance drops significantly compared to 1440p. The 4090 now pulls a bit more ahead of the 7900 XTX, but they remain really close on the wall, and the XTX clearly stands out much more from the 4080 Super in this title than in quite a few others. The 7900 XT and 4080 Super are neck and neck, with the 3090 Ti more or less tied with the 4070 Ti Super just behind. The 7900 GRE and 7800 XT still are stuck together, followed by the 4070 Super, 3080 and 4070 triplet, with the 7700 XT still right behind, but we are now below the 60 FPS average here. The 2080 Ti finally ends up ahead of the 6700 XT, and interestingly, we see that the 4060 Ti 16GB clearly stands out from the 8GB model in this title, and the 3060 Ti finishes slightly ahead of the 4060 Ti 8GB too. So the game at 4K clearly requires more than 8GB of VRAM, but no mega stutters or slowdown from what I could see. The performance remains stable, but they are just much lower than if you had more VRAM, which is quite similar to what we saw on Ratchet & Clank and some other games. Likewise, the 3060 Ti with its larger memory burst allows a small gain over the 4060 Ti 8GB here. Moving on to upscaling and frame generation, and I had to cut that into several graphs because there was a lot of data. So a little comparison here with the 4060s family between DLSS and FSR frame gen, with DLSS as the basis for upscaling. And what we can see here is that even at 1080p, Unfortunately, Nvidia's FrameGen does not bring any gain, we even lose performances. If we compare to upscaling alone, it's not the first time that we have seen this kind of behavior, and it's one of the main criticisms I have had with Nvidia's frame generation, which is that it has a significant cost in resources, and in certain scenarios like here, it does not bring anything, and it ends up with this situation where it is the cards which potentially need it the least which benefits the most from frame generation. FSR FrameGen is doing slightly better, even if the game compared to DLSS alone is pretty slim for the 4060. It's a bit better with the 4060 Ti, so we can already also conclude that the FSR frame generation isn't exactly free either in this game. At 1440p we find some other interesting points. We can already see that, once again, for the 4060, the DLSS frame generation here does not bring much compared to DLSS upscale on its own. FSR frame gen allows a small gain, but once again, I would probably just use DLSS upscale and no frame generation at all. For the 4060 Ti's, we see that the 16 gig model does better with DLSS frame gen than the 8 gig model, because yes, Nvidia's frame generation consumes some VRAM, which also explains that sometimes it can struggle with 8 gig card, but still. Even for the 16 gig model, we gain nothing over DLSS upscale alone, so yeah, FSR FrameGen can now be an interesting fallback for those cards if you like the feel of it. At 1440p, I also did the test with some other cards of all types, and we see that be it Nvidia, AMD or Intel cards, being able to couple the upscaler of each brand with FSR FrameGen is pretty cool, and it can be a little boost of smoothness for all cards, even if clearly the AMD cards scale the best with FSR frame generation, which allows some fairly modest cards to have very playable performances here. And at 4K on the same cards, well, for older cards like the 3060 Ti, the experience will not be incredible. Frame generation at 70 FPS isn't great, so more adjustments will have to be made, because ideally, to get a good experience with frame generation, we want at least 60 FPS average before adding FrameGen on top. For the 2080 Ti, on the other hand, well, it's not bad at all, just like for the 3080 and 3090 Ti. And for AMD cards, it's going pretty well too. 73 FPS on average for the 6700 XT is very decent for 4K upscale, with still the frame generation option available if we want to. For the RTX 40s now, well, once again, for the 4060 Ti, we see that the 16 gig model is doing better than the 8 gig model, but we also see that the FSR frame generation also caused the 4060 Ti 8 GB to lose performances here. So yeah, both FrameGen technologies have a cost. As a reminder, Nvidia's FrameGen will use the OFA units of the RTX 40s to operate, but as the smallest cards do not have as many of those units as the higher end models, depending on the games, the gain is not necessarily huge, and sometimes we don't even gain anything and we lose performances. And as I have been saying for a long time now, the why and how Nvidia's frame generation being an RTX 40 only feature is probably that simple. With slower OFA units on the RTX 2030 series, the results would probably often be disappointing too, even if, yeah, getting the option to see it would have been better than just looking it completely. For AMD's frame generation, it uses async compute, but the problem with async compute is that games use it also more or less intensively, and the smoothness gains from FrameGen will also be more or less important depending on how the games behaves and the power of the cards, and we see here that FSR FrameGen does not always bring crazy gains on this title either. Otherwise, interesting to also note that from the 4070 to the 4090, the DLSS frame generation is more stable than the FSR frame generation at the 1% level for Nvidia cards. But well, considering the performance with just the upscaling on this game, do we really need frame generation here? Aside from absolutely wanting to match the refresh rate of your screen, it just isn't all that important in this game to me. I would just use upscaling and no FrameGen at all. We quickly take a look at the scaling of the game presets at 4K with the 4090, and we see that, as is often the case, switching from very high to high settings allow a gain of 20%, and this is clearly the biggest gain between the different graphical presets of the game. And in terms of upscaling scaling, well, here too, between native and DLSS quality, it's 45% more performances and 60 with balanced mode. So, as is often the case, just lowering the preset to high rather than ultra or very high here and using an upscaling quality mode will allow you quite a huge performance gain for a moderate visual loss. We finally move on to the CPUs, and well, the game seems to just love 3D V-Cache, with the 7800 X3D dominating everyone here, and even the 5800 XT comes a notch ahead of the 14700K on this title on average performance, and roughly the same at the 1% level. But the game is not all that demanding CPU-wise, it's largely playable for all processors here, since even the Ryzen 3600 can output around 100 FPS on average. So, overall, the game is not light, but it doesn't require a crazy PC either, and we see that even with fairly modest cards, we can run the game at 4K very nicely with a small upscale, and 1440p is manageable even for relatively small cards. But it's true that for an older gen title, it's not super light either, but we have also seen much worse recently in terms of images, so it's not that bad. The port is pretty good, no major issues. And that's awesome. It's a game that I really enjoyed at the time on PS4, and if you missed it because it's a PlayStation game and feel like you will enjoy the atmosphere and gameplay of this game, it's a good version to play on. I am still a bit curious to see if the GeForce card really have an issue driver-wise with this game so far, or if it is just a game that AMD cards just love. There is a few of those, maybe it's one of them, but it was interesting to see that it's a bit different from what we usually see. And not much else to say here. As usual, if you enjoyed the video, the usual YouTube stuff, it's dumb but it helps. As always, a big thank you to the members of the Ko-fi page who supports me directly, it really helps a lot. And see you again very soon for more videos. Take care of yourself and your family. Bye.